Before we begin, you need to understand one number: 400. 400 ships captured in 3 years and 8 months. Not in a lifetime, not across a decades-long career. In less than 4 years, one man, commanding one ship, then a small fleet, took more prizes than any pirate in the documented history of the Golden Age. For comparison, Blackbeard, the most famous pirate in history, captured approximately 40 ships in 2 years. Henry Every, who pulled off the greatest single pirate raid in history and walked away with £100 million in modern terms, took fewer than a dozen ships in his entire career. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Samuel Bellamy, all of the names that fill the history books of the golden age of piracy, none of them came close to 400. Bartholomew Roberts captured more ships than all of them combined. He did it sober. He preferred tea to rum. He held church services on his ships. He enforced an 11-article code of conduct with a rigor that most naval officers of his time would have considered excessive. He dressed in crimson damask, carried himself like a man who expected the world to notice him, and wore a diamond cross around his neck that he had taken from the King of Portugal's personal treasure fleet. He was, by any objective measure, the most successful pirate who ever sailed. And on the morning of February 10th, 1722, a single piece of grapeshot, no larger than a coin, struck him in the throat and ended everything. His crew, following his instructions, threw his body overboard in his finest clothes before the Royal Navy could board the ship and claim him. He went into the Atlantic still dressed for the occasion, still wearing the crimson waistcoat and the diamond cross, and the ocean received him and kept him. He was 39 years old. He had been a pirate for 3 years and 8 months. He left behind a record that has never been matched, and a question that no one has fully answered in 300 years. How did one man, in less than 4 years, accomplish what no one else in the history of maritime piracy managed in a lifetime? This is the story of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the greatest pirate who ever lived. John Roberts was born on May 17th, 1682, in the village of Little Newcastle in Pembrokeshire, in the southwest corner of Wales. His father, George Roberts, was a landowner of modest means. The family was not wealthy by any standard that would have mattered in early 18th century Britain, but they were not destitute either. They had land. They had standing in their small community. They were the kind of family that produced solid, capable people who worked hard and expected nothing spectacular from life. John Roberts left all of that behind when he was approximately 13 years old. He went to sea. The specific circumstances of this departure are not documented clearly. Pembrokeshire was a maritime county, close to the sea, with centuries of connection to the coastal trade routes and the fishing grounds of the Atlantic. Going to sea at 13 was not unusual for a boy from this part of Wales, who had limited prospects on land and some aptitude for the water. He shipped as a sailor, almost certainly beginning in the coastal trade before moving to longer voyages, and he spent the next 23 years learning his craft. By 1718, he had worked his way up to the position of second mate aboard a slaving vessel called the Princess of London. This was not a glamorous position, and the work itself was among the most morally compromised that any sailor of the period could engage in. The Princess of London transported enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa to markets in the Americas and Britain. Roberts was the second officer of a ship whose cargo was human beings transported against their will across the Atlantic. in conditions that killed a significant portion of them before they arrived. He had spent 2 decades becoming competent and reliable in the maritime world, and the maritime world had placed him on a slave ship as a junior officer, with no particular prospects for advancement, no accumulated wealth, and no reason to expect that the next 20 years would be significantly different from the last 20. And then, in February 1719, everything changed. A pirate ship appeared. Its captain was a Welsh pirate named Howell Davis, and when he captured the Princess of London and examined her crew, he found in John Roberts something he immediately recognized: a skilled navigator, a competent sailor, a man who clearly had the intelligence and the capability to do far more than his current position suggested, and a man who, when offered the choice between remaining a second mate on a slave ship and joining the most successful pirate crew operating off the coast of West Africa, made the kind of calculation that would define the rest of his short and extraordinary life. Roberts joined Davis's crew. He had been a pirate for 6 weeks when everything changed again. On May 19th, 1719, Howell Davis sailed the Royal Rover into the harbor of Principe Island off the west coast of Africa, flying false colors, pretending to be a Royal Navy vessel hunting pirates. The deception worked. Davis was received as a guest by the Portuguese governor. He was invited to a meeting. The meeting was a trap. Davis walked into it and was shot and killed. The crew of the Royal Rover was now without a captain. They gathered on deck and did what pirate crews did in these situations. They voted. The vote was not close. They elected John Roberts, the man who had been among them for 6 weeks, the navigator from the Princess of London, who had barely begun his pirate career. Roberts accepted. He changed his name to Bartholomew. And then he turned the ship around and sailed back to Principe. He attacked the island where his captain had just been killed. His crew killed as many Portuguese as they could find. They burned what could be burned. They took 2 ships from the harbor. Roberts had been captain for less than 48 hours. The attack on Principe was the first statement of who Bartholomew Roberts was going to be. Not a man who absorbed losses and moved on. Not a man who calculated that revenge was an unaffordable luxury. A man who responded to violence with immediate and disproportionate counter-violence, who understood that in the world he was now operating in, the response to being hurt was to make the cost of having hurt you so catastrophic that no one would consider doing it again. He was 36 years old. He had been a professional sailor for more than 2 decades. He had been a pirate captain for 2 days. He was just beginning. Roberts turned the Royal Rover south toward Brazil, and what happened off the Brazilian coast in the summer of 1719 established that this was not going to be an ordinary pirate career conducted at an ordinary scale. He spent weeks watching the shipping patterns off the Brazilian coast before he moved. What he was looking at was a Portuguese fleet of 42 merchant vessels anchored together, guarded by 2 warships, each carrying 70 guns. 42 ships. 140 guns of military escort. An entire commercial fleet assembled in one place, protected by armed vessels that outgunned his single ship many times over. Roberts sailed into the middle of the Portuguese fleet at night. He came alongside one of the merchant vessels quietly, in the dark, and spoke to her captain. He told the captain that if he raised any alarm or made any signal, the ship would be sunk immediately. The captain, confronted with a pirate ship appearing out of the darkness, while surrounded by 41 other vessels and 2 warships that had apparently not noticed the intruder, did the rational thing. He cooperated. Roberts extracted information. He asked which ship in the fleet was carrying the most valuable cargo. The captain told him. One of the ships in the fleet was carrying a particularly extraordinary cargo: gold, diamonds, and a golden cross encrusted with diamonds that had been commissioned as a gift for the King of Portugal himself. Roberts transferred to the Sagrada Familia, the ship carrying the royal treasure, and sailed her quietly out of the Portuguese fleet before dawn. By the time the fleet realized what had happened, Roberts was gone. He had sailed into the middle of 42 ships and 2 warships, found the most valuable vessel in the fleet, and stolen her without firing a single shot. The total value of what he took from that single night's operation was approximately 40,000 gold moidores, plus the diamond cross intended for the King of Portugal. In modern terms, tens of millions of pounds, from one night's work, using intelligence and nerve rather than firepower. The diamond cross went around Roberts's neck. He wore it for the rest of his life. But the success was followed almost immediately by a disaster that would have ended a less determined man's career entirely. Walter Kennedy was one of Roberts's crew members who had been given command of the Royal Rover while Roberts took the Sagrada Familia to chase another target. When Roberts returned to where he had left Kennedy and the Royal Rover, neither the ship nor Kennedy was there. Kennedy had simply sailed away with the Royal Rover and everything aboard her, including the accumulated plunder from months of operations. Betrayed, robbed by his own man, left with one ship and a crew whose morale had just been catastrophically damaged. Roberts sat down and wrote a code. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts were 11 rules that every man who sailed under his flag had to sign. They were remarkable documents for their time, and they would define the way his crews operated for the rest of his career. Every man had a vote on all major decisions. Every man had equal access to fresh provisions. The captain received 2 shares of any prize. The quartermaster received 1.5. Every ordinary crew member received 1 full share. No man could take more than his share. Any man who stole from the common fund would be marooned or executed. No fighting among crew members aboard ship. All disputes were settled on shore with pistols and swords. Any man who lost a limb in service received specific compensation from the common fund. 800 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 800 for a left arm, 600 for a right leg, 500 for a left leg, 100 for an eye, 100 for a finger. This was disability insurance, written into law by a pirate captain in 1719, 2 centuries before most governments considered such a thing their responsibility. No women were to be brought aboard. Lights out by 8 in the evening. No gambling with cards or dice on the ship. Musicians could rest on the Sabbath if they chose. Roberts distributed the articles and required every man to sign them. Those who refused could leave. Those who signed were bound by them, and Roberts enforced them without exceptions and without favoritism. He renamed the Sagrada Familia the Royal Fortune, a name he would give to several successive ships throughout his career, always transferring it to his most powerful current command, and he went back to work. The Caribbean campaign of 1719 and early 1720 established Roberts as a force that the colonial authorities could not ignore and could not effectively stop. He captured ship after ship across the Caribbean. His methods varied with the circumstances. When his reputation was sufficient to produce surrender without fighting, he took prizes without bloodshed and moved on quickly. When resistance was offered, he responded with a completeness that discouraged future resistance. He was not sadistic in the way that Edward Lowe was sadistic. His violence was purposeful, rather than gratuitous, but it was real, and the record of what happened to people who resisted him was clear enough that most captains chose not to. He had a specific and consistent response to the colonial authorities who attempted to suppress him. When the governor of Barbados and the governor of Martinique both sent ships after Roberts in early 1720, Roberts responded by designing a new flag. The flag showed a figure representing Roberts himself, standing on two human skulls. The letters beneath each skull identified them. A-B-H, A-M-H, a Barbadian's head, a Martinican's head. He flew this flag from the mast of his ship as he continued operating in the waters around the islands whose governors had tried to stop him. He was not hiding. He was advertising. The flag told every ship on every horizon exactly who was coming and what had already happened to the authorities who had tried to prevent it. This was psychological warfare conducted with complete self-awareness. Roberts understood that his reputation was one of his most powerful weapons, and he managed it with the deliberateness of a man who had thought carefully about what he was doing and why. He then did something that demonstrated the same quality of deliberate, calculated boldness that had characterized every major operation of his career. He sailed north to Newfoundland. The events at Trepassey Bay in June of 1720 are among the most extraordinary episodes in the entire history of the golden age of piracy, and they deserve careful attention because they reveal more about who Bartholomew Roberts was than almost anything else in the record.
Trepassey Bay is on the southern coast of Newfoundland, on the northeastern edge of the North American continent. In the summer fishing season of 1720, it was full of ships, 22 vessels at anchor, representing the assembled fishing and merchant fleet of the region. The combined crews of those 22 ships numbered approximately 1,200 sailors. Roberts arrived with a single sloop, the Fortune, carrying approximately 60 men and 10 guns. He came in with black flags flying and drums beating and trumpets playing, making as much noise and presenting as aggressive a visual statement as possible. And the 1,200 men aboard those 22 ships looked at his single small vessel and made a decision. They ran. Not all of them ran in the sense of sailing away. Some of them literally abandoned their ships, rowing away in small boats. The crews of ships that their captains tried to maneuver away from Roberts mutinied rather than face him, refusing to sail toward the pirate and overpowering their own officers. In every case, the calculation was the same. The name Bartholomew Roberts and the black flag of the Royal Fortune and the sound of the drums and trumpets coming across the water of Trepassey Bay was sufficient to paralyze 1,200 men. Roberts was reportedly astonished by what he found. He captured every ship in the harbor. He held their captains prisoner aboard his vessel, and every morning he fired a cannon and required all the captains to appear before him on his deck. Every morning the captains of 22 merchant vessels assembled on the deck of a 10-gun sloop to report to the man who had taken their ships without firing a single shot. Roberts apparently found their lack of resistance more contemptible than anything else about the situation. He burned most of the ships. He kept a brigantine that suited his purposes. He took what he wanted from the others. Then he went to sea, and in the following weeks captured 9 or 10 French vessels, in addition to the 22 he had already taken. He kept one of the French ships, a vessel he particularly liked, armed her with 26 cannons, and named her the Good Fortune, later renaming her the Royal Fortune after repairs. He now had a fleet. The period between June 1720 and April 1721 was perhaps the most prolific of Roberts's career, and it was also the period that reveals the most about the specific quality of violence he was willing to employ when the situation seemed to demand it. In October of 1720, Roberts's fleet encountered a group of Dutch merchant vessels somewhere in the Caribbean. The Dutch sailors resisted more than most of Roberts's targets had, and the resistance was not forgiven. Roberts ordered his men to cut the ears off several of the Dutch prisoners. Some of the Dutch prisoners were hanged, others were beaten severely. One account from the period describes Roberts's men using some of the prisoners as targets for pistol practice, shooting at them while they were still alive. These acts are documented in multiple contemporary sources, including the records from the subsequent trials of Roberts's crew members after his death. They cannot be attributed to embellishment. They happened. Men who had tried to resist, who had made the calculation that fighting was worth the risk, paid a price that Roberts calculated would discourage others from making the same calculation. This is the part of Roberts's story that the legend of the brilliant, disciplined, tea-drinking pirate with his democratic code tends to minimize. He was genuinely capable of directing systematic violence against prisoners. His code of conduct protected his own crew. It did not protect anyone who fell into his hands. He also, in April of 1721, did something that crossed a line that even the colonial authorities who had been pursuing him found difficult to absorb. He captured a French frigate of 52 guns in the waters around Martinique. Aboard the frigate was the governor of the French colony of Martinique. Roberts hanged the governor from the yardarm of his own ship. The killing of a colonial governor was not merely a criminal act in the ordinary sense. It was a political provocation that could not be treated as routine piracy. When Roberts hanged the governor of Martinique from a yardarm and sailed away, he forced the governments of France and Britain to respond at a level and with a seriousness that no previous act of piracy had required. This act, more than any other in his career, was the one that sealed his fate. It forced the deployment of serious naval resources specifically dedicated to ending him. By 1721, Roberts commanded not a single ship, but a fleet of 3 vessels, each heavily armed, operating in coordinated fashion across enormous distances. The Royal Fortune carried 40 cannons and 250 crew members. The Ranger was a second ship under its own captain. A third vessel completed the fleet. In January of 1722, Roberts sailed into the harbor of Ouidah on the coast of West Africa, which is now part of the modern nation of Benin. Ouidah was one of the most important ports in the Atlantic slave trade, a place where enslaved people were assembled by the thousands for transportation across the Middle Passage. 11 ships in the harbor surrendered immediately. 11 ships without a shot. Roberts took what he wanted and prepared to leave. One of the captains of the surrendered ships refused to pay the ransom Roberts demanded for the return of his vessel. Roberts burned the ship with 80 enslaved Africans still locked in the hold. This act, documented in the records of the subsequent trial of his crew, was one of the most condemned of his entire career. The Africans in that hold had no connection to the dispute between Roberts and the ship's captain. They died because a captain refused to pay, and Roberts chose to make an example of the refusal. Among the Africans Roberts encountered during his West African operations, many chose to join his crew after being freed from slave ships. By the time of his final battle, a significant portion of his crew were African men sailing under his black flag on the same terms as every other crew member. One share of every prize, one vote on every major decision. Captain Challoner Ogle of the HMS Swallow had been hunting Roberts for months when he found him at Cape Lopez off the coast of present-day Gabon on the morning of February 5, 1722. Roberts had 3 ships in the bay. His crew had been celebrating the capture of a ship the previous day. Many of them were drunk or sleeping off the previous night's festivities. Roberts himself had been awake late. Ogle was intelligent. He did not immediately attack. Instead, he used the Swallow's profile to lure one of Roberts's ships out of the bay. The pirates on the Ranger saw the Swallow and thought it was a merchant vessel trying to escape. Captain James Skirm of the Ranger gave chase. Once the Ranger was away from the other ships and out of sight of the bay, the Swallow turned and engaged. The battle was fierce. 10 pirates died in the opening broadsides. A cannonball took off Skirm's leg below the knee. He refused to leave the deck and continued to command from where he fell until the Ranger was overwhelmed. The Swallow then turned back toward Cape Lopez. On the Royal Fortune, a man who had deserted from the Royal Navy recognized the Swallow's profile and told Roberts what was coming. Roberts ordered his men to battle stations and dressed in his finest clothes. This decision, documented in multiple accounts of the battle, deserves full attention. He knew what was coming. He understood the odds.
He knew that the Swallow was a purpose-built naval vessel under experienced command, and that the Royal Fortune, with many of her crew drunk or incapacitated, was at a severe disadvantage. He put on his crimson damask waistcoat. He adjusted his weapons. He wore the diamond cross from the King of Portugal's fleet. He put the red feather in his hat. He was going to meet this as himself. The Swallow opened fire. Roberts moved across the deck of the Royal Fortune, directing his men, trying to find an angle that would allow him to break contact and run. He was not a man who fought for glory when running was the better option. But the Swallow was faster than he had expected, and his crew was in no condition to execute the kind of precise seamanship that escaping under fire required. The grapeshot found him. Grapeshot was a cluster of small iron balls packed in canvas, fired from a cannon, spreading like shotgun pellets across a wide area. One piece struck Roberts in the throat. The accounts differ on whether it severed his spinal column immediately or whether he survived long enough to be moved below deck. What is agreed is that he was dead within minutes of being hit. He was in his finest clothes when the shot found him. His crew carried his body to the rail. They had his instructions. He had told them what to do if this happened, because he had been preparing for this for years, with the same practicality he had brought to everything else. They put him over the side in his crimson waistcoat and his breeches and his red feather and the diamond cross that had belonged to the King of Portugal. He went into the Atlantic. The Swallow boarded the Royal Fortune and found the crew in chaos, the fight gone out of them the moment their captain fell. 272 men were taken prisoner. The trials of Roberts's crew were held at Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast in April of 1722, 2 months after the battle at Cape Lopez. The Admiralty Court that convened for the trials was operating under legal authority that owed something to Roberts himself. The trials of Henry Every's crew in 1696 had exposed weaknesses in the law governing the prosecution of pirates, and subsequent legislation had expanded the court's jurisdiction specifically to address those weaknesses. The legal framework that sent Roberts's men to their deaths had been built, in part, in response to the challenge that men like Roberts represented. Of the 272 men taken prisoner at Cape Lopez, 52 were convicted of piracy and hanged. 37 were sentenced to serve in the Royal Africa Company's operations in West Africa, which was essentially a form of penal servitude. 17 were sent to the Marshalsea prison in London. 74 were acquitted. 65 of the prisoners, the African crew members who had sailed under Roberts's flag, were sold back into slavery by the court that had just finished trying the others for crimes. James Skirm, who had lost his leg at the knee during the battle with the Swallow and had refused to leave the deck until his ship was taken, was among those hanged. He did not petition for mercy. He did not claim coercion. He had signed Roberts's articles and sailed under his flag, and he accepted the consequence. The executions were conducted at Cape Coast Castle. The bodies were displayed afterward in the standard manner, a warning to the crews of the ships that passed by. Roberts himself was beyond the reach of any display. He was on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean off Cape Lopez, 2 months decomposed, in his crimson damask, still wearing the cross. What does it mean that Bartholomew Roberts captured 400 ships? The number is usually presented as a statistic, a record, a data point in the argument that Roberts was the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. But statistics flatten reality. To understand what 400 ships actually meant, you have to think about each one of those ships as a separate event, involving specific human beings, making specific decisions under specific conditions. 400 captains who saw the royal fortune on the horizon and made a calculation. Most of them struck their colors. Some of them tried to run and were caught. A few tried to fight and were overwhelmed. Each one of those 400 encounters involved men whose livelihoods, whose cargoes, whose ships, and in many cases whose physical safety depended on the outcome. 400 times, over 3 years and 8 months, the outcome was the same. Roberts won. He won against convoys. He won against single merchant vessels. He won against vessels that should have been too large or too well armed for him to take. He won at Trepassey Bay against 22 ships with a single small sloop. He won at Ouida against 11 ships in harbor. He won at St. Kitts when he sailed in with flags flying and drums beating, and every ship in the harbor immediately surrendered. The consistency of the winning is what is genuinely extraordinary. Every pirate of his era had successful operations. None of them had 400 of them. Part of the explanation is tactical intelligence. Roberts planned carefully. He gathered information from captured crews about shipping patterns, about cargoes, about the locations of naval vessels. He used that information to position himself where prizes were likely and threats were distant. He moved constantly, which made him difficult to hunt, and made his appearances in any given area unpredictable. Part of the explanation is his code. The crew that sailed under Roberts's articles was a more reliable and more effective fighting force than most pirate crews, precisely because they knew exactly what they were fighting for and what they would receive. The equal sharing of prizes meant that every man had an equal stake in every capture. The disability compensation meant that risking your body in the service of the ship had a specific financial value attached to it. Men who knew they would be compensated for injury and would receive a guaranteed share of every prize had more reason to fight effectively than men operating under more chaotic arrangements. Part of the explanation is his sobriety. In a world where drunkenness among pirate crews was endemic and often contributed to disasters, Roberts's refusal to drink gave him a tactical advantage that he exploited consistently. He was clear-headed when his opponents, including eventually his own crew on the morning of his final battle, were not. And part of the explanation is something that cannot be fully quantified. He was exceptionally good at what he did. The navigation, the tactics, the leadership, the management of a crew of men who had no obligation to follow him except their own choice, and his demonstrated ability to deliver what he promised. All of it reflected a quality of competence that was rare in any profession, and rarer still in one that selected against careful planning
and rewarded impulsive risk-taking. Roberts did not take impulsive risks. He took calculated ones. He assessed the probability of success and the cost of failure, and he moved when the calculation favored him. The 400 ships were not luck. They were the product of a man who was very good at a specific and difficult thing, doing it very consistently over a very compressed period of time. The question of his cruelty is one that the historical record does not allow to be minimized. The Dutch prisoners who lost their ears, the Africans who burned in the hold of the ship whose captain refused to pay the ransom, the governor of Martinique hanged from a yardarm, the men used for pistol practice. These are real events, documented in multiple sources. They cannot be erased by the democratic articles, or the tea drinking, or the church services.
They were part of the same career that produced the articles and the tea and the church services, and the same man was responsible for all of them. Roberts was not cruel in the way that Edward Lowe was cruel. He was not deriving pleasure from the suffering itself. His violence was purposeful, calculated to produce specific effects in the behavior of the people who encountered him. Cutting the ears off Dutch prisoners who had resisted him was meant to communicate something to the next crew that considered resisting. Hanging the governor of Martinique from a yardarm was meant to communicate something to the colonial governments that had been sending ships after him. The communication was effective. The cruelty produced the desired results in terms of reducing resistance and raising the cost to the colonial authorities of continuing to pursue him. But the Africans who burned in the hold had nothing to do with any of that. They were caught between Roberts and a ship's captain who had refused to pay, and they died for it. No strategic communication was being made to anyone that required their deaths. They died because Roberts chose to burn the ship rather than release them. This is the darkest fact in his record, and the one that is most difficult to accommodate within any narrative that treats him as a heroic or admirable figure. It is also the one that is most consistently omitted from popular accounts of his career. He was a complicated man, operating in a brutal world, and the brutality was sometimes his, and not just the world's. Roberts's pirate code, the articles he wrote after Walter Kennedy's betrayal, had a legacy that extended well beyond his own career. The concept of a written contract governing the behavior of a pirate crew was not unique to Roberts, but his version was more detailed, more consistently enforced, and more widely known than any previous iteration. The records from the trials of his crew members, which were published in London in 1724 as part of Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, spread the articles to a reading public that found them simultaneously scandalous and fascinating. The articles were scandalous because they applied democratic principles to criminal enterprise, because they provided for the welfare of men who had rejected the legal and social order that governed everyone else, because they treated pirates as people with rights rather than as outlaws who had forfeited all claims to protection. They were fascinating for exactly the same reasons. The men who sailed under those articles had been sailors in the Royal Navy and the merchant service before they were pirates. Many of them had experienced the specific conditions that Roberts's articles were designed to improve: the arbitrary authority of officers who could flog men for minor infractions, the wage structures that paid officers far more than ordinary sailors for work that was no more dangerous, the absence of any compensation for injury suffered in service. Roberts's articles were, in a specific sense, a response to those conditions, an attempt to build a community governed by principles that the legitimate world had refused to adopt. The historical irony is that the pirate articles of the Golden Age, and Roberts's in particular, influenced later discussions of labor rights and workers' protection in ways that their authors could never have anticipated. The specific provisions for equal sharing of prizes and for disability compensation
appear in the scholarship of labor history as early examples of workers demanding and receiving protections that capitalist enterprises of the period routinely denied. Roberts did not design his articles to make a political argument about labor rights. He designed them to prevent another Walter Kennedy, to ensure that the crew he built could be trusted not to rob him. But the principles he embedded in the articles had implications beyond their immediate practical purpose, and those implications have echoed forward through the history of how human beings have organized collective work. On the morning of February 10th, 1722, when the HMS Swallow appeared off Cape Lopez, Bartholomew Roberts had 47 ships left to capture to reach his final total of 470. If the higher of the historical estimates is accurate, he would not capture them. The grape shot found him at approximately 10 in the morning, while the battle was still ongoing and the outcome was still uncertain. He had not yet given up. He was still on deck, still moving, still directing the men around him. The shot that killed him was random in the way that all grape shot was random, a blast of small iron balls that spread across an area and hit whatever was in their path. What was in its path was the throat of the most successful pirate in the history of the golden age of piracy. The battle continued after he fell. The crew fought for a period without him, as crews sometimes do when they have not yet processed that the situation has changed irreversibly. Then the fighting stopped, and the men threw down their weapons, and the Swallow's crew came aboard, and the royal fortune was taken. The 300 years that have followed have not produced another Bartholomew Roberts. No one has captured 400 ships in less than 4 years. No one has built the kind of disciplined, organized, contractually governed pirate fleet that his articles made possible. No one has maintained the combination of tactical intelligence and physical courage and administrative competence that allowed him to keep winning consistently against opponents who had every structural advantage. He is famous for the number, for 400, for the sheer scale of what he accomplished in the time he had. But the number is, in a sense, the least interesting thing about him. The most interesting thing is the code he wrote after he was betrayed. The articles that turned a gang of desperate men into something that functioned for 3 years like a coherent and effective organization. The disability insurance embedded in a pirate contract 2 centuries before governments considered it a right. The equal sharing that made every man's contribution to every capture equally valuable. He built something in the years between 1719 and 1722 that had never been built before in the history of maritime piracy. He built it in the face of constant danger and constant opposition and constant pressure from the naval powers that were trying to destroy him. He built it on a foundation of violence and theft and occasional atrocity. He built it in the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea and off the coast of West Africa, with men who had signed a paper and staked their lives on the promise that paper represented. And then the grape shot came, and the paper was no longer relevant, and the man who had written it went over the side in his finest clothes, and the ocean took him, and the 3 years and 8 months were over. He left 400 ships behind him. He left the articles behind him. He left the Diamond Cross at the bottom of the Atlantic, and he left a question that no one who has spent time with his story has been able to fully answer. How did a Welsh farmer's son who spent 20 years as a competent but unremarkable merchant sailor become, in less than 4 years, the most successful pirate in the history of the Golden Age? The record says he did it. It does not say how. It says only that he did, and that when the morning of February 10th, 1722 ended, he was gone, and nothing like him came after. The Atlantic is very old. It keeps what it takes. Bartholomew Roberts is still down there, somewhere, in his crimson damask,
with the Portuguese king's diamond cross around his neck, and 400 ships in his record, and the question of how he did it, unanswered above him. Still there, still waiting for someone to figure it out.